People think a lie has to be small to survive. A little exaggeration. A little polish on a resume. A story that stays close enough to the truth that no one bothers to check. That is not how the best imposters worked. The best imposters did not tell small lies. They told enormous ones, and then walked directly into the rooms where those lies could be tested. They sat across from wives, generals, judges, and royal courts, and dared anyone to notice. Some fooled a wife who shared a bed with them for years. Some fooled a country. One fooled a king's own throne. Today we count down 10 of the most convincing imposters in history, people who did not just lie about who they were, but built entire lives on top of the lie, sometimes for decades, sometimes until the day they died. Let's begin. Number 10. You already know this one, even if you do not think you do. Frank Abagnale is the man behind Catch Me If You Can, the Spielberg film where a baby-faced Leonardo DiCaprio forges checks, poses as a pilot, a doctor, and a lawyer, all before turning 21. Here is the part the movie does not tell you. Much of what you think you know about Frank Abagnale came from Frank Abagnale himself. His memoir, written years after his supposed crimes, was the primary source for the film. Journalists, who later tried to verify his story, ran into a problem. Court records, old employers, and airline logs from the era did not match the scale of what he claimed. Some experts now believe large portions of his most famous cons, the airline pilot disguise, the hospital job, may have been exaggerated or invented outright, decades after the fact, to sell a book and a speaking career. The final twist is the best one. Abagnale spent the rest of his life as a highly paid fraud prevention consultant, lecturing banks and governments on how to spot liars. The man who may have lied about being a con man built an entire second career teaching people to catch con men. Number 9. In 1591, the Crown Prince of Russia died in mysterious circumstances. Officially, it was an accident. Unofficially, almost everyone suspected the country's regent, Boris Godunov, had him killed to clear his own path to the throne. A decade later, a man appeared in Poland claiming to be that same prince, somehow alive. He had the right age. He had a convincing story. And crucially, he arrived at a moment when Russia was starving, unstable, and desperate for anyone who was not Godunov. This impostor did not just fool a village. He raised an army, marched on Moscow, and was crowned Tsar of Russia. He ruled for less than a year before a rival faction had him killed in a palace uprising. What happened next is the detail history rarely leaves out of the footnotes. His body was dug up, burned, and according to legend, the ashes were loaded into a cannon and fired back toward Poland, the direction he had come from. Historians still are not entirely sure who he really was. What is certain is that for 11 months, an impostor sat on the throne of one of the largest countries on earth, and the entire nation called him Tsar. Number 8. In 1918, the Russian royal family was executed. Officially, everyone died. Unofficially, rumors persisted for decades that one daughter, Anastasia, had somehow survived. 2 years later, a woman was pulled from a canal in Berlin after a suicide attempt. She refused to give her name. Eventually, she began telling hospital staff she was Anastasia. For the next several decades, this woman fought court battles across Europe, gave interviews, appeared in documentaries, and convinced a portion of the public, and even a few minor Romanov relatives, that she was the last surviving Grand Duchess. Her story became so culturally powerful, it inspired multiple films, including an animated musical that generations of children grew up watching without knowing the true ending. The true ending arrived in 1994, after her death, when DNA testing finally became available. The results did not match the Romanov family at all. They matched the family of a Polish factory worker with a documented history of psychiatric hospitalization, a woman who had disappeared around the same time Anastasia allegedly died. She spent her entire adult life and won a piece of the world's sympathy, as someone who almost certainly never met a single Romanov in her life. Number 7. This is the imposter story that gets uncomfortable fast. In 16th century France, a young man named Martin Guerre abandoned his wife and village and disappeared for years. When he finally returned, the village welcomed him back. He knew names, memories, private family details, even intimate specifics about the marriage. There was just one problem. Some later testimony suggested his own wife may have quietly known this man was not her husband and said nothing for years, because the imposter was, by every account, a better husband than the original. Eventually, the real Martin Guerre returned, missing a leg from a war injury, and the deception collapsed in a courtroom. The imposter was executed. Historians still debate exactly how much the wife knew and when. But the case remains one of history's most studied examples of a fraud that succeeded not because it was clever, but because the people closest to the lie had their own reasons not to expose it. Number 6. Ferdinand Waldo de Mara did not fake being a professional. He faked being several professionals, at the same time, across an entire career. He impersonated a monk, a prison warden, a teacher, and a psychology PhD. But his most infamous role came aboard a Canadian naval ship during the Korean War, where he served as the ship's surgeon. He had never attended a single day of medical school. When wounded soldiers were brought aboard, de Mara performed surgery by locking himself in a room with a textbook moments before each procedure, reading ahead just far enough to stay one page in front of his patients. Multiple soldiers survived operations performed by a man with zero medical training. His fraud was eventually exposed, not by a mistake in the operating room, but by a newspaper article back home that recognized his face. He was quietly removed from the ship rather than prosecuted, partly because none of his patients had died. He spent the rest of his life bouncing between fake identities, later becoming the subject of a Hollywood film that, fittingly, could not keep up with how many identities he actually used. Number 5. Sometimes an imposter does not just deceive a person. She deceives an entire monarchy and helps burn down its reputation in the process. In 1780s France, a con artist named Jean de Valois Saint-Remy convinced a powerful cardinal that Queen Marie Antoinette secretly wanted his help, acquiring an absurdly expensive diamond necklace, and would repay him personally if he arranged the purchase in her name. To sell the lie, Jean arranged a secret nighttime garden meeting between the cardinal and a woman dressed to resemble the queen, actually a hired prostitute who exchanged a few whispered words in the dark before slipping away. The cardinal, convinced he was now the queen's secret ally, arranged the purchase. Jean and her accomplices took the diamonds and vanished. The queen had never asked for the necklace and knew nothing about it, but by the time the fraud became public, the damage to her reputation was already done. Many historians consider the scandal one of the sparks that helped ignite public hatred of the monarchy in the years leading up to the French Revolution. One con artist, one fake garden meeting, and an entire royal reputation collapsed. Number 4. In 1866, a heavy-set butcher living in Australia received a letter that would change his life. A wealthy English family was searching the world for their missing heir, a nobleman lost at sea years earlier. The butcher decided he was that heir. He sailed to England, could not speak French, could not recall childhood details the real heir should have known, and looked almost nothing like him. None of that stopped tens of thousands of ordinary British citizens from rallying behind him anyway, seeing his claim as a chance to embarrass an aristocratic family they already resented. The resulting trial lasted 188 days, making it, at the time, the longest court case in British legal history. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse daily, treating the imposter like a folk hero standing up to the elite. He lost. He was convicted of fraud and perjury, and spent years in prison. But the case revealed something more disturbing than one man's lie. An entire portion of the public was willing to believe an obvious imposter, not because the evidence supported him, but because they wanted the rich family to lose. Number 3. Archibald Bellany was born in England, pale-skinned, English through and through. He moved to Canada, adopted the identity of a Native American man, and rebuilt himself entirely under the name Grey Owl. He became one of the most famous conservationists and authors of his era, lecturing across 2 continents, writing best-selling books, and meeting royalty, all while presenting himself as an indigenous voice for the wilderness he was trying to protect. Here is the detail that makes this one sting. His deception was not shallow. He lived the identity so completely that even his own wife, a Mohawk woman, did not know he was actually an Englishman until after his death, when journalists dug into his real birth records. He died believing, or at least hoping, that the good his fabricated identity accomplished for conservation might outweigh the lie underneath it. Historians still argue about whether he was right. Number 2. In the early 2000s, a soft-spoken man calling himself Clark Rockefeller moved through the highest circles of Boston and New York society, name-dropping a family fortune that did not belong to him. He was, in reality, a German immigrant named Christian Gerhartsreiter, who had spent over 2 decades inventing and discarding fake identities, each one wealthier and more connected than the last. As Clark Rockefeller, he married into money, collected an impressive art portfolio, and socialized with people who never once questioned why a supposed Rockefeller had no verifiable family history anyone could trace. The fraud held for years, until a bitter custody battle over his daughter pushed him to something far more serious than lying about his last name. He kidnapped the child during a supervised visit, triggering an FBI manhunt that finally connected his fingerprints to an entirely different unsolved case from decades earlier. The most polished identity on this list did not collapse because someone checked his family tree. It collapsed because the lie finally touched something he was not willing to lose control of. Number 1. The final imposter on this list did not need centuries of separation from the internet to succeed. She used the internet to succeed. A young woman calling herself Anna Delvey moved through New York's wealthiest social circles, claiming to be a German heiress with a multi-million-dollar trust fund on the way. Hotels extended her credit. Private jet companies flew her without full payment. Friends covered dinners and vacations, certain the money was simply delayed in transfer, not non-existent. There was no trust fund. There was no heiress. Her real name was Anna Sorokin, and the fortune existed only in the confidence with which she described it. She was eventually convicted of theft and fraud, but not before extracting tens of thousands of dollars in unpaid bills, loans, and favors from people who should have known better. Strip away the designer clothes and the Instagram captions, and the mechanism is identical to a French peasant convincing an entire village he was someone else's husband 500 years earlier. The tools changed completely. The method never did. 10 imposters. 10 completely different eras, countries, and disguises. A peasant, a monk, a czar, a princess, a surgeon, a duchess, a nobleman, a conservationist, an heir, an heiress. And underneath every single one of them, the exact same mechanism. People do not get fooled because they are stupid. They get fooled because believing the lie is often more comfortable, more exciting, or more useful than accepting the truth. A wife gets a better husband. A cardinal gets closer to the queen. A crowd gets to watch the rich lose. A country gets a czar when it desperately needs one. The imposter rarely creates the lie alone. He finds a hole in what people already want to believe and steps directly into its shape. So the next time someone tells you a story that feels a little too perfect, a little too convenient, ask yourself the harder question. Not whether they could be lying. Ask what you would gain by believing them anyway. Stay sharp, and stay for the next dark chapter.